Well, corruption still remains a vice that worries every Ugandan to an extent that the president of this country, once he has an opportunity to speak on fundamental days like he did while he was celebrating 37 years of NRM, the fundamental message was on how to deal with corruption. The same vice has prompted a number of old brooms in this country to write on issues of how to deal with corruption. And one of those is the Professor Wilson Kanyehamba. In fact, he has written an entire book addressing how we can deal with corruption. Tonight on the Coffe Court, where we ask the critical questions, I am joined by the Executive Director of the Coalition Uganda, Mr. Marlon Agaba, to weigh in on how we can deal with this vice in this country. Mr. Marlon Agaba, my pleasure, and thank you for finding time to speak to us.
Thank you for having me.
If you were to define corruption, from your perspective as civil society organization, how would you define it?
Yeah, corruption is quite broad and diverse, and it has different faces. But it has been defined in a simple way as misuse of public office for personal gain. So any form of misuse of an office that is public in nature for personal gain and aggrandizement, that is seen as corruption. But when you look at our legal framework, especially the Anti-Corruption Act...
Before you get there, what exactly do you mean by personal gain? Is it the individual person?
Of course, like if you have a public office, you're a public servant, and you are using public resources for your own personal means, it could mean embezzlement, misuse of public property that is supposed to be public in nature, but you use it for your own personal and family gain.
Okay.
Yes.
What are these forms of corruption that we have in this country?
There are quite a number, one of them being using public property, for instance, for personal gain. You have seen public cars, for instance, being used to ferry agricultural produce, building materials. We have abuse of office, and so many people have been convicted under that. We have nepotism and sectarianism, giving jobs, for instance, based on blood relations or on affiliations, for instance. You have corruption in tenders, corrupt procuring tenders. You have aspects like influence peddling. You have bribery. I think that's the most common form of corruption, paying money for a service that should actually be free. Then we have diversion of public resources. Funds are supposed to do a particular activity, and then they are diverted to another activity. We saw that quite a lot with the parish development model, and some officers were arrested. We have false accounting, providing false accountabilities. So it's quite broad, but those are some of the forms. And also recently, I've seen new forms being introduced, like money laundering, for instance, is a very big issue. We have corruption in taxation, like underassessment, sometimes no assessment, giving waivers that are questionable. All those are different forms of corruption.
You've talked about giving a job to a brother or sister. If my brother does qualify for this job, why would I call that corruption?
You see, there are standards. Even in corporate governance, you have what they call standards. Ideally, in some institutions, it could be outright that you are not allowed to employ a relative. I think in some international organizations, it's quite clear that, and you have to declare that if you have a relative in an agency and you're applying, you are required to declare that. But in corporate governance, is that there's what they call conflict of interest. If, for instance, I'm the executive director and my wife or brother or sister is applying to join the organization, definitely it means that I will have conflict of interest because I have decision-making powers.
But that applies everywhere.
In organizations that are quite broad, maybe the best or the least you can do is to excuse yourself from that process. And if there is clear evidence that you are not part of the process, you didn't influence in any way, and the policies don't stop that from happening, then that's fine. But the problem comes where, one, you are in decision-making power. Sometimes even you are part of the selection committee, and then you employ a person related to you. That is a problem. It's quite problematic.
You've also talked about influence peddling. Can we live in a society where, because now life nowadays is about connection. The more you're connected is the more you'll find life easy. So how does that connect to influence peddling as a form of corruption?
And you see, that's part of the problem. that
It is not, because
yes,
you can't live in, you can only survive in society.
yes,
If there are
yeah,
people you can connect.
because we are getting mediocre people in important offices because of connections, because of relations, and because of other things, and this has become at an expense. Eh? We have seen in some of the public offices where people who are incompetent being hired. There's one place we were at, it was a district where someone who had never been to a nursing school was hired as a nurse because she was related to the chairperson. And this is a person going to treat people. But because they had, I mean, it happened because they have connection. So it is happening, but that is a very big problem. And that's why you are seeing a lot of incompetence everywhere, whether in government and even in the private sector. There's a lot of incompetence. For example, you see buildings falling on people. Yeah? You see structures that cannot last for a time. You see roads being constructed and the next day they're already developing potholes. That is part of the problem. Influence peddling. We're getting people who are not qualified, but just because they know someone, they're occupying public office.
But we never hear you come out to talk about some of these other forms. You only concentrate on issues of money, issues of money, issues of money. I never hear you pronounce on issues of bribery, on issues of influence peddling, to mention but a few.
We look at corruption in its entirety, and we look at the different forms as and when they emerge. The challenge may be that in most cases, maybe bribery is the most talked about because it's the most common. It's what ordinary Ghanaians encounter on a daily basis, bribery, whether in the judicial system, whether at police, whether in lands or utilities. Bribery is the most common form of corruption. But even the other forms of corruption that are there, and you talk about them. And you see each and every form of corruption can be given a monetary value. Each and every form.
So how do you monitor, how do you look at the bribery and turn it into monetary value? How do you look at the influence peddling and many of those and turn it into monetary?
The bribery is quite easy because bribery usually is in terms of money. It's money exchanging hands. Of course, there are a few instances where people provide the property, like in the district service commissions. I've heard of examples where people bring cows in exchange for jobs or a plot of land, but that can also be monetized if you want. So all these different forms, there's a monetary value attached. If it is a teacher supposed to be teaching pupils and is not showing up in class to teach, what loss is the nation getting now or in the future when that child doesn't get the education it's supposed to be getting? These are the people who will be on the street because they have no skills. So each and every form of corruption has a monetary value attached to it. Whether it's also a doctor supposed to be treating patients but is not at a health facility, and we are losing expectant mothers, there is a loss so as a country
if somebody steals money in a public office and he puts up a road which will help you, help your children and help other people, why don't we let such people go?
No,
they've stolen the money and used it for a cause which is genuine.
That will not happen. I haven't seen any thief has built a road. They are building hotels, and they are building hotels. They are building their own houses.
Those provide employment as well. When they put up
how many people? Let me give you an example.
There's employment
You are supposed to build a health facility that one is going to employ maybe like 40 health workers. That two is going to be treating a population of around 100,000 people. You steal that money. You build your own house at home where you're only employing a maid or two and a gardener. What benefit is that to the people? Or even if you build a hotel, you're supposed to construct a road to help the people. You build a hotel. That hotel will only benefit you and your wife and children at the expense of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who would have benefited from that kind of investment.
So you find that unfair?
Yes, it only benefits a new people. It creates a class of artificial super rich people, but who haven't worked hard for those riches at the expense of a population. So it just widens the gap and creates people whom you think are rich, but whom are, I wouldn't even call that richness, really. So they aren't.
Several scholars have come up to provide ways on how we can deal with corruption. The president, while he was in Kakumiro, said, we are going to jail them. The IGG is saying it is important that to do a lifetime audit. Your take on some of these approaches, on if they can surely be
better? One, the president has been talking a lot about corruption and how he knows the thieves and how he's going to deal with them. But I don't think he's serious on really dealing with the thieves.
Sure.
Yes, because he has been talking.
Well, what's your
Let him
measurement of
act.
seriousness?
Let him act. The measurement, we are losing 10 trillion each and every year to corruption. And how much are we recovering? Around 30 billion.
That's actually less. The IGG is saying 20 trillion.
Yes, okay. Even if it's 20 trillion, and then you are in charge, you are losing 20 trillion.
So you want the president
and you
to
keep
ban
speaking.
them? You want the president to ban them?
The president has power, and the president has so many skills and resources at his disposal that he can use to fight corruption if he decided to become serious on it. The president has been serious, for instance, on COVID. And Uganda did well on COVID. Have been commended everywhere. He did well on fighting Ebola.
Because the fight
so why is corruption still a problem? Why aren't we dealing with corruption? But the commitment is not there fully to fight corruption.
With the institution of the institutions like the State House and Corruption Coalition, with the emphasis on police and many other security agencies, I think he's done enough.
One, there's some commendable work that has been done in terms of the legislation that we have laws to fight corruption. And then two, in terms of the institutions, I've talked about them. They're quite a number. Could be around over 15 agencies supposed to fight corruption. But then there are other aspects that we haven't looked at, that sometimes we put up institutions, but they don't have autonomy to do the work they should be doing. Sometimes it's an issue of funding. Sometimes it's an issue of interference in their work. And sometimes it's an issue of selective application of the law. And in fact, that all these good laws we have, they are rarely implemented. They are not being implemented. So yes, the institutions are there. We commend the government for that. But I think there's seriousness in terms of implementation. Can we implement the law? And can we put a lot of emphasis on recovery? Because if you're losing around 10 trillion each and every year, you are recovering around 30 billion. Because you see, corruption is about the gain. Somebody engages in corruption because there is a gain, they are getting the money. And if you don't take away that gain from them, then you are not effective at fighting corruption. So the effort should be on recovery of monies that have been stolen. That's when we shall really have good impact in terms of fighting corruption.
Okay. What are other countries doing that you think Uganda as a country is not doing? Especially when we are dealing with this kind of vice.
Fighting corruption requires total political commitment. Especially from the leadership.
It goes beyond the political issue. It goes beyond politics. It can be a social. It can be a financial. In one way or the other, some scholars say it can also be a spiritual matter. One,
we live in countries and contexts where leaders are respected and leaders wield a lot of power. And you have seen in Europe, there are countries that can last 2-3 years. They don't have even a prime minister or a head, even sometimes no government. And this year, everything is functioning well. That wouldn't happen here. So in our context, that the leadership is quite important in terms of setting the standards, setting the climate when it comes to issues like fighting corruption, or even any other social vice. So we need to see leadership at different levels, and not just maybe the presidency, but whether it is a minister, whether it's a chairperson, whether it is an executive director, or anybody heading office, there has to be clear leadership and a clear commitment from the very start that is no, and if it's not corruption, it means no. Not no for particular people and yes for some people. There have to be clear standards that are applied across board.
So what about the other forms of the influence peddling and the bribery? So how can we monitor this? Because the financial aspect, it's very easy to monitor, the financial part of it. How can we monitor the other types?
One, of course, with corruption, the problem is that now we have reached a level where corruption is becoming normalized. And you interact with people, someone tells, corruption is chintu cha bulijjo, ekyo kye kiriwo buli omu akimanyi nti enguzi weeri. When you have reached that level of corruption, it even becomes so hard to monitor. But you see, it comes with the kind of climate that you have said. We are not here. I mean, our parents tell us in the 80s, 70s, yes, corruption probably was there, but not at this level. So we have set this climate, we have enabled the corruption to thrive, So we need to change that. We need to change the mindset. We need to change this kind of climate you have said. We need to go back to the zero tolerance. Government talks about zero tolerance, but it's just on paper. It has to be zero tolerance in terms of implementation. Now, once there's that clear commitment from the head that each and everybody involved in corruption will be dealt with, that kind of information, that kind of approach will easily trickle down to the ordinary people. And it is, like I said, something that we have built over decades, 2 or 3 decades, and this is where we are. And we take probably another decade to reverse what we have really built over these years.
And so what role does the Muntu wa Wansi have to play? Especially
Muntu wa Wansi has a role to play, but he's...
Because you seem to be saying it's a collective response.
Muntu wa Wansi has challenges. That one, of course, I can tell the non person not to pay a bribe, not to get involved in corruption, not to sell their votes. But they are living in a context that is extremely corrupt. If you are telling a person not to pay a bribe, but they go to a health facility, a man probably have your wife going to give birth asking for money. You don't pay the money and your wife dies, you get it. Or you need a service. You're asking for illegal money, you don't pay, and you fail to get the service. It also becomes problematic. That's why we have been interacting with people. They tell you that, what do you want us to do? Because this is everywhere. So we need to address corruption in its entirety, like I said, in all the different aspects of it. And leadership really is key in this, setting the climate for fighting corruption all the way from the top, trickling down to all the different sections of society.
You seem to be just talking about it. I've read part of your posters say, dispose, talk about them. Those who are corrupt, talk about them. You are only just verbal when it comes to fighting corruption as a vice. I've not seen you practical as Uganda, of course, and Corruption Coalition Uganda.
Practical in what sense?
Of course, coming up with practical measures is what I'm saying. Like the president saying, please jail them. That is too practical. As Uganda Coalition for Corruption, what are some of those practical?
One is that public education is core to our work, sensitizing people on this problem called corruption and on their responsibilities. But also, too, we contribute in terms of policy in this country. And we do a lot of research and advise the government in terms of the policy options that it can take up. We have, like, we're a coalition, we have partners, we have members who do, for instance, monitoring of government services, and reporting of cases, and collaborating with the different agencies of government when they're investigating, when cases go to court. And so it's not just about talking, but we also have other things that we are doing in terms of empowering, in terms of building a critical mass of people to come up and really demand because of it. Because you have seen people these days coming up and demanding when there's corruption, exposing corruption. Civil society has played a very big role in terms of educating people on their rights. So that is at the core of the work. But the primary mandate in terms of arresting, in terms of prosecuting people, that is the primary work of government agencies.
Well, Mr. Agaba says civil society organization has done whatever it takes to see to it that corruption comes to zero. Is it possible, I'll still ask, meanwhile as we plan to wind this discussion, that we can have corruption at zero level? In Uganda, is it possible?
No, it may not be possible within our generation, our lifetime.
So you're fighting a battle
to
that
bring corruption to zero, because yes, even in developed nations in Western Europe or in America, in North America, corruption is still there, and you see so many cases of people being jailed for corruption-related offenses. But there, corruption is not a development challenge. It's not a hindrance to development. You know, now corruption is one of the biggest hindrances to foreign direct investment in Uganda. And companies in Europe or whatever, they look at corruption as when there were at least 5 hindrances, corruption would be in the top 2 or top 3. And now we're moving to a level where corruption is being budgeted for as the cost of doing business.
Maybe
that's where we have reached. So we can reduce corruption to where it's not a development challenge, where it's there, but it is manageable and doesn't affect development. And it's not a social issue within society that we can achieve.
So Mr. Agaba says in some areas this corruption is budgeted for. Maybe that will continue the discussion for another day. Your parting shots, Mr. Agaba.
Yes, I think fighting corruption is a responsibility of us all. But what is important, like I said, is that leadership is very important. And leadership is at different levels, whether in your home or in the office, wherever you work, you can make a difference in terms of fighting corruption by saying no and setting a climate where corruption doesn't thrive.
Mr. Agaba, thank you for finding time and speaking to us. One of the most important words of a man are his last words. Like he did say, it is our collective responsibility if we are to manage this vice called corruption in this country. This is the Coffe Court. My name is Fred Makubuya.